welcome everyone. My name is Joe Sabia, and I'm chairman of the economics department and director of the Center for Health Economics and Policy Studies at San Diego State University. I have the great pleasure of leading this first public webinar of global action to end smoking. We're in for, I think, an informative and spirited conversation among economic experts who are going to shed some light on the frontier of ongoing research in the economics of electronic nicotine delivery systems, or ENDS. So to begin, I'll tell you a bit about myself. I'm an applied microeconomist with a research specialization in the economics of risky health behaviors, including tobacco control policy. My research has been funded by a variety of agencies, including the National Institutes of Health, the Social Security Administration, the Troche Family Foundation, the Charles Koch Foundation, and since earlier this year, Global Action to End Smoking. I received my PhD in economics from Cornell University, and I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics. I serve on the editorial board of Contemporary Economic Policy, and I'm a co-editor of the Southern Economic Journal. Now, to kick off this event, I want to introduce Cliff Douglas. Cliff is the president and chief executive officer of Global Action to End Smoking, a nonprofit independent grant-making organization dedicated to ending the illness and death caused by smoking. Cliff, thanks so much for being here, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate it, and thank you for leading the way. Let me also first thank our organizer and host, Dr. Ida Urekli, who is, of course, with our organization, our lead economist, health economist, and who has done a wonderful expert job for a long time, and that includes the development of this event. So let me also begin by just saying good morning and afternoon and evening to everyone. Thank you for making it from whatever time zone you're in. I'm very happy to join you for this important discussion and to introduce our reestablished organization, now Global Action to End Smoking, and to emphasize the importance of continuing our support for valuable economic research in the area of tobacco and nicotine and health. I'd like to also underscore the need for social justice in smoking cessation and the impact that the market can have on this area of public health. And as we know, smoking disproportionately affects those in low and middle income countries, and also in general disadvantaged and marginalized communities everywhere. And you know, these populations are most likely to smoke and become ill as a result. And unfortunately, again, as many of us know and work with every day, they're often, far too often, unable to access and afford the support they need to quit smoking. Economic research is one of the key disciplines that helps us address that global challenge, and it's one of the key disciplines that Global Action supports. I'm really delighted that we have on our expert panel today highly respected economists from Cornell University, Pepperdine University, and San Diego State University. These veterans in this area have contributed invaluable expertise in examining the economics of e-cigarettes, as well as other tobacco and nicotine products from a variety of perspectives. And we also have a growing number of grantees from low and middle income countries, such as Giorgi from Tbilisi University in Georgia. The smoking epidemic is a multifaceted problem, and so it takes a multidisciplinary approach to address this challenge most effectively and comprehensively. The grant we announced last week, for example, to the Urban Institute in the United States reflects our commitment to research on the economic side of smoking cessation. That grant will provide information on the barriers that low-income individuals in the US through Medicaid coverage face as they try to quit smoking, and will develop potential cutting-edge solutions. And that really reflects the underlying purpose, the high priority that our organization gives to making progress in this area. So I'm excited about the discussion today, featuring some of our current grantees and other experts whom we look forward to learning from. And all of you have quite valuable insights to share with us, ranging from presentations of new data to comprehensive analysis. And I want to thank you for your time and all of the effort you've put into sharing your understanding and your ongoing research with all of the folks who are joining us now and who also will be able to benefit down the road from the recorded version of this event. You know, I've maintained throughout my career in research, academia, advocacy law, and government service that solutions to the global smoking epidemic exist within a well-regulated tobacco and nicotine marketplace. That's something that we're working on achieving in the US. I know many of us are seeking to do that where we are, and we're all across the globe living with a lot of different experiences and challenges and opportunities depending on our government systems, the cultural and societal issues that we have to address. And so our coming together in forums like this really does help considerably in synthesizing our understanding. In terms of focusing on the need to devalue deadly products, those most deadly products, particularly cigarettes and other combustible products, while also exploring the need and the opportunity to make the full range of evidence-based cessation tools and reduced risk products within that vein widely available to the millions of adults who need them. In fact, based on current data, more than 1 billion people worldwide who use cigarettes and then other products as well. And we know that the population of people who smoke need a variety of options to meet their unique needs. I stress time and again, and I know others of us do as well, that it's so important to appreciate that one size does not fit all. Every individual is unique. Every individual lives with their own needs and challenges and deserves respect and compassion. And to the furthest extent possible, in a science-based, well-regulated marketplace, understanding of the different ways in which they can succeed in stopping smoking, that activity that causes the death, as we know, of 1 out of every 2 long-term users. We also know that there's a significant challenge of illicit, unregulated products. The economic consequences of these black and gray markets ultimately have a significant effect on the accessibility and appeal of smoking cessation tools and the way that this whole market acts to influence the behavior of hundreds of millions, if not more, people on our planet. So we have a great deal to consider and discuss. And I look forward now with all of you to the presentations and discussion that we're going to engage in. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Cliff, so much. I know Cliff is able to be with us for some amount of time at the beginning of this event. He has some other duties that he's going to have to go to in a little while, but we're excited to have him for as long as he's able to be here. Thank you, Cliff. Next, I want to introduce Tim Phillips. Tim is the Managing Director of Tamarind Industries, a global independent market and regulatory intelligence service, providing data for businesses operating in a number of fast-moving consumer sectors facing regulatory change, including vape, cannabis, and tobacco alternatives. Tamarind Intelligence provides market-leading insights and regulatory tracking for clients ranging from governments and academic institutions to multinational companies and professional service providers. Tim has run Tamarind Intelligence for the past 10 years. So Tim's going to give us a global perspective on INS regulation. And now I turn the floor over to Tim.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks very much. And thank you, Cliff and Ida at the GA team to invite me. Joe, you introduced all of us as economists, and I think I'm the odd one out here in that I'm not an economist. I'm very pleased to be invited amongst this august group of senior economists, but I'm not. I'm very much a lawyer. My background actually was working in kind of law firms commercially, and then I worked in the European Commission as well. So I come at this from a slightly different aspect. I think the idea of me introducing was to give a bit of an overview of the regulatory position for vape around the world. I'm going to focus on vape. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other areas of novel nicotine products that I think are interesting, but mainly I'm going to focus on vape. I'm just going to get rid of that. Right, can everyone see my screen? I hope so. Joe, thanks very much for the intro. Wait a minute, let's try and move that one on. Okay, works like that. Right. Yes, you talked about what we are, Tamarind's intelligence publisher of what we're best known for e-cig intelligence, which, as the name suggests, is market and regulatory data on the e-cig and vaping market. We've been around for 10 years. Just an important thing to point out for listeners to this webinar, I think, is that we're independent, so we do work with governments as well as industry, and I hope we kind of bridge the two. We work with academics to some extent too, and I'm really pleased to be doing more of that. All right, so regulation around vaping and novel nicotine around the world is extremely complicated, and this first slide, I suppose, tries to speak to that issue. These are relatively recent products. They're quite new. Regulation always takes longer to catch up with market realities, of course. And what we're seeing around the world is an increase in the amount of regulation being applied to these products. This map of the US, of the world, gives a bit of a view of where we are. The red, of course, is negative, is traffic light scheme. So red is kind of heavy regulation or bans. The orange is a midway point, and the greens are quite positive around this sector. And this is our outlook. So this is a chart that is representing what we are seeing happen in the next 5 years. So we're expecting the countries that are coloured red to be quite negative, and the perspective on regulation to be quite negative. And as you can see, quite a lot of the world, certainly the world that we cover, that we track 110 countries around the world, quite a lot of them are coloured red, unfortunately. And I think more pressing as well, perhaps for the discussion today, is that the countries that are red include some of the largest countries in the world in terms of population. So, this regulation is applying to a huge proportion of the global population at the moment. So the general kind of view is quite negative. And in fact, as we see countries moving towards regulating, in many cases, particularly some of the lower and middle income countries have not regulated yet. And as they move towards regulation, they tend towards a strict interpretation of regulation for vape devices, and indeed for all novel new nicotine products. On the right-hand side there, some of the main areas that we're seeing come through. So there's, of course, complete bans on products, and we're seeing, that take place in a lot of Asian and Latin American markets. You'll notice on the US there, we're interpreting the US currently as a ban. That's a bit harsh. Of course, we understand the process that the US is going through with PMTAs, but the reality of the market at the moment is that pretty much 100% of the products that consumers are using are illicit, and so we're kind of seeing this as a de facto ban at the moment. We're seeing lots of strict regulation come through, so we're seeing lots of product restrictions, flavor bans, lots of plain packaging, restrictions on the kinds of retail environments that you can sell product through, very high taxes and so on. Environmental restrictions are coming through really strong, and I wanted to bring this point up as a kind of an urgent thing for the sector to look at. I mean, environmental issues, particularly in Europe, are going to mean the demise of many of the current formats, particularly disposables in Europe, in a relatively short amount of time. So this kind of broad legislation that covers many different types of products is going to certainly have a big impact on vape and other products similar to those. And then we've got these single-use product bans. So we've got things like disposables being banned in many countries. More than half the European markets are currently considering a ban on disposables. It's quite clear, of course, in the US that none of the disposables in the market at the moment, and there are thousands of them, none of them have approval through PMTA. And I think we're we're fairly clear that none of them are likely to get approval either. So general sort of outlook, pretty negative. You know, I wouldn't start to say that harm reduction is dead, but I think as a concept, a lot of countries are not embracing. And what we looked at 5-10 years ago, this idea that harm reduction was something that governments would get behind as a policy, is really not being embraced by a majority of countries. We track, there we are, 544 stakeholders. A very small proportion, just about a fifth of those, are actually positive towards harm reduction. That's not a very scientific test, but it just kind of, I think, paints the picture. A lot of the positivity is coming out of European markets, but even those we're expecting to become more negative over the next 5 years. And another thing to point out is, you know, the politics of this is actually what has a massive impact on regulation. So things like elections and election cycles have a massive impact. So the US elections this year will have a big impact on the future of vape regulation. We've already seen in the UK latest news that the general election has been called for early July. And we're already seeing that the generational ban that the UK was going to bring in, and the right-wing Conservative government were about to bring into force, is going to be tabled, is going to be pushed back. I don't doubt that it will happen at some point, but these kinds of things have a massive impact on the way that regulation develops. I won't dwell on this, and I certainly won't get into the details, but things like tax being applied to vape, this is just illustrative of what's going on. We're seeing more and more countries come through. So on the left, you've got the US and Europe in 2019, on the right, 2023, and the position, as you can see, is many more states in the US and many more countries in Europe were taxing vape products. And that process will continue, and we're likely to see more and more tax applied. And in fact, in Europe, we're likely to see some kind of a tax directive, including vape products, with a minimum level of tax at some point, you know, in the relatively near future. It's massively delayed. We've been inspecting it for years now, but it's likely to come through eventually. Having given you all that really negative news, I think there is some positive stuff going on. And as I said, we've got countries that are coming to regulate this sector for the first time. In many cases, they're quite negative, but actually we're starting to see some positive news come through. On the left-hand side there, so 2019 compared to 2024, of the countries that we track, we were seeing more countries banning the products in 2019 compared to 24. So some are opening up. And indeed, we're starting to see some movement in some regions as well, which are generally positive. So, you know, if you look at the two areas that I've circled there, so Latin America and Middle East and North Africa, I think we're seeing some movement towards positive developments for vape regulation in those markets. I mean, it couldn't get much worse in Latin America. Frankly, you've got Brazil and Argentina completely banning the product category. We're already seeing some movement there. It'll take some time, but you know, in Latin America, we've already seen some movement in Chile, and Panama recently have moved to open up markets. In the Middle Eastern region as well, we're starting to see some change, and it's quite negative. I'll talk about it in a minute, but there are some things moving. So this is a very movable landscape. On the right-hand side there, so Argentina, we think, are likely to move towards legalizing, and obviously with that new government, we're likely to see lots of things being liberalized there. But Kazakhstan has already, this is a bit out of date actually, it's already moved to ban products, and in Norway we're seeing some regulation move quickly, because I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but this is taken from our regulatory tracker. As I say, we track all these countries. So Middle East and North Africa, we are starting to see some kind of comprehensive approaches in the Middle East region towards vape, and we're starting to see some vape bans being overturned. Particularly Arabic-speaking countries. Turkey and Iran remain very much of the view that these bans should exist. We're seeing very high taxes across the region, but the Gulf Cooperation Council, so the grouping of countries in the Middle East that are often producing a consistent view on policy, are starting to regulate rather than ban. Latin America, again, as I said, it's very negative picture at the moment with a lot of bans in place, particularly the vast majority of the population do not have access to legal products, but we think that will change in Argentina. It's already changing in Chile. And at some point, we may well see changes in places like Brazil as well. Latin America's slightly different policy is made country by country. There's not a lot of consistency between the regulatory policy changes, but I think that those two examples, Middle East and Latin America, are just giving some cause for hope. And again, I think the reality on the ground is that the regulation changes dramatically from month to month, frankly. European Union, well, we've got big parliamentary elections in a few weeks' time. It'll be very interesting to see what happens as a result of that. And as I said before, elections have a huge impact on the way that policy is developed. And so the European Union is no different. We're likely to see a move towards the right-wing parties in the parliament. And generally, that means that there's likely to be a move towards more open regulation and less restrictions, but let's see. Without going into massive details, so there's lots of European legislation that is being worked on right now. It takes a huge amount of time. It's already really delayed, but we will see some of this kind of comprehensive approach towards regulation of vape, and similarly of other products, so heated tobacco and pouch as well. There you can see some representations of some of the kind of key things that we see coming through in Europe. But suffice to say that the regulatory position will change going forwards. I wanted to leave you with this because I think it will lead into some of the discussion we're going to be having around a kind of understanding of the regulatory position and an understanding about the product category. I mean, it's really important to remind ourselves that this is a new category and the general public themselves treats a lot of these products with some suspicion. I think if you go out on the street and ask people what their views are of vaping or indeed any of the other kind of alternatives to combustible cigarettes, it's generally quite negative. But I think also we do this survey every year. We didn't do it last year, but we did it 3 years in a row from 2020 to 22. And we're doing a survey of European Union MEPs, so members of the European Parliament. Of course, it's all going to change now because we've got a different parliament coming through. But I think what's really interesting, what came out of this that really struck me as being relevant to this discussion is that if you can segment the responses that we got, and you split up that group between those MEPs who are aware and have some knowledge of these products, whether it's vape or heated tobacco or whatever, but if you split them up between MEPs who understand what these products are and those that don't, you can see the results. On the left, the MEPs who've got some knowledge, they're much more likely to agree that these products, the vape and other alternative products are less harmful than smoking, and far fewer of them are going to say they don't know. On the right hand side, those MEPs that don't know, and they reflect exactly the same trends, I think, in the general population, those that don't know about the products are much more likely to be negative about them, and that has a massive impact on the way that these products are treated and the way eventually they're regulated. And of course, MEPs have a huge say in the way that the policy for Europe will develop. So I think this chart for me says quite a lot about the strength and the importance of getting across to general population really what these products are about and what the facts are. So that's it for me. I'm very happy to send these slides to anyone that wants to write to me. So I've got my contact details here, and yeah, I'd love to answer questions as part of the following discussion.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think that was a fantastic sort of overview of worldwide ENDS regulation. Thank you. That really sets the stage well for the conversation I think we're about to have. So it's my pleasure now to introduce a panel of experts on the economics of ENDS, specifically in tobacco control more generally, and facilitate a discussion in which I'll serve as moderator. Cliff, Tim, and I will be part of this panel, and I'm now pleased to introduce the 4 others. First, Alan Mathios. Alan is professor in the Department of Economics and the Jebby Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell University. He served as Dean of Cornell University's College of Human Ecology from 2007 to 2018, and recently served 7 years as Commissioner for the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. He is co-editor of the Journal of Consumer Policy and serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Consumer Affairs and the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing. Came to Cornell following 6 years of employment at the Federal Trade Commission, where he served as a staff economist in the Division of Economic Policy Analysis. A major focus of Alan's research is on the effect of Food and Drug Administration policies, including the regulation of tobacco products, on consumer and firm behavior. His research has been funded by a variety of sources, including multiple and ongoing grants from the National Institutes of Health, as well as support from foundations, including Global Action to End Smoking, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Merck Foundation. Second, Donald S. Kenkel is the Andrew Dixon White Professor in the Department of Economics at the Jebby Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell University. His research in empirical health economics focuses on consumer health behaviors, including drinking alcohol and smoking, and is supported by a series of grants from the U.S. National Institutes of Health. His current research is mainly on the economics of tobacco harm reduction and is supported by grants to Cornell from Global Action to End Smoking. He has a strong teaching and research interest in benefit cost analysis and is former president of the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis. From 2018 to 2020, he was a senior economist and then chief economist at the Council of Economic Advisors in the Economic Office of the President. He holds a BA degree from the University of Kentucky and a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. James E. Prieger holds a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. He's a professor at Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. His research interests include health policy related to tobacco products, illicit trade, communications and broadband policy, and other policy-related microeconomic areas. He possesses 25 years of consulting experience and was a senior economist with the Federal Communications Commission. He's published over 50 articles in peer-reviewed journals and chapters in scholarly books. He is also a senior fellow at the Reason Foundation and a senior economist at Botech Analysis Corporation. He holds a BA degree from Yale University. Giorgi Mzhavanadze is a PhD student in economics at Tbilisi State University in Georgia. Over the past 4 years, in collaboration with the NGO Healthy Initiatives and Cornell professors Kenkel and Mathios, he has conducted policy-relevant economic and public health research on smoking and tobacco harm reduction products in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and published a number of papers. In addition, Giorgi is currently engaged in providing individual consultancy services for various research and policy institutes. His professional journey includes roles as senior research associate at Georgia's largest commercial bank and as deputy head of the Macroeconomic Policy Research Center at the International School of Economics in Tbilisi. His areas of expertise encompass macroeconomics, health economics, and gender economics, and since 2017, Giorgi has been actively involved in tobacco research. So we're excited to talk with this panel today about research in the economics of ends and how economists think about these questions, maybe sometimes how that thinking might differ from public health or medical professionals, and what we can learn by thinking like economists about these questions. And it's in that context that I want to start with a question for Cliff. We kind of know fairly directly how we might think public health researchers and medical researchers could contribute to the overall, mission of global action to end smoking, of ending smoking in our generation and the illness caused thereof. Where specifically do you see economic research sort of fitting into the mission of global action to end smoking relative to the contributions of other disciplines?
Great. Thanks for starting with that question and for all of your introductions, Joe. I think that the basic answer regarding the role of health economics research is that to address the complex public health challenge that we face here, it's important to consider multiple levels of understanding and to develop multiple types of interventions. And this includes understanding the impact intended and sometimes unintended of policies such as bans and restrictions, taxes on tobacco and nicotine products. Economic analyses are an important and quite well-established methodology to do this. I think, for example, of the critical work done by our panelists and also others such as our colleagues Ken Warner and David Levy, Mike Pesco. These are folks who many people know, whose work, like yours, over decades has been relied upon by the tobacco control community, by government decision makers, and the media. The bottom line is economic research matters, and it plays a direct role in contributing to public understanding, to the science, and potentially policy change. You know, I wanted to touch on, by the way, while I just have a moment here, on a basic but critical topic raised by Tim Phillips' informative presentation. And by the way, Tim, you can feel reassured that there are at least two of us who are lawyers and not economists, but I guess sometimes we know how to play economists on TV. But I just want to note that while tobacco harm reduction, particularly this term, has become controversial over time, it didn't used to be, in large part because of the perception on the part of some tobacco control advocates that it is an industry term. You know, we are really focusing on the fact that the term harm reduction, it's a widely accepted and normalized concept when you think of just harm reduction that's long been implemented in the area of illegal drugs. Think of the use of methadone in place of heroin, automobile safety, think about seatbelts and airbags, and in a number of other areas as well. So, you know, beyond this sort of linguistic question, my view is that there are multiple ways to explain and make clear that this is a legitimate and science-based public health concept. You'll be hearing more from us going forward. But, you know, for one, I also like to emphasize the importance of not only reducing, but minimizing harm and maximizing health. So that's my little added on opinion column moment to share here. And I think that it's important as we think atmospherically about all of the work that we're doing from multiple disciplines, and particularly in this case from the area of economic research. So again, thank you very much, and I appreciate that all of you have come together to address these issues.
Thank you so much, Cliff. I appreciate that. So as I begin to ask questions about to panelists, I want everyone to feel free to kind of jump in if you've got sort of additional comments you want to make, you know, in the area. Don't be shy. This isn't intended to be, you know, entirely sort of a structured event. But I guess I'll start by building on one of the areas that was addressed in Tim's talk and was raised by Cliff earlier as well. An important economic issue with respect to ends products, and that involves information and misinformation. So Kip Viscusi, we know, a well-regarded economist at Vanderbilt, has written extensively through the years on how individuals may overestimate the health risks of tobacco use. Now, many doctors and public health advocates say this is good news and evidence that public health campaigns are doing their job or working. So I'd like to start with asking Alan, is misinformation always a bad thing, especially if it helps people to make healthier choices?
Thanks, Joe, for that question. So I'm going to share a slide in a second about our current state of misinformation. But in terms of is misinformation, can it be helpful? And I think one has to take a short-term versus a long-term view on that. You know, in the short term, manipulation of information to achieve some goal might achieve it again, in the short run, but trust in information in the long run depends on accuracy. And in the long run, then if one loses trust in information sources, then it's going to be very, very challenging to get to an equilibrium where people trust it and respond to it in appropriate ways. So it's very short-sighted to think that you can deceive the consumer for a long time. So now I'm going to share a slide to give you a sense of where we are in information. So Professor Kenkel and I have been doing choice experiments where we're examining how adult smokers make their decisions between cigarettes and e-cigarettes and quitting. And as part of those surveys and experiments, we asked the same question that was asked at the beginning of this webinar. And this was a very informed, the participants in this webinar are very well informed. They believe that e-cigarettes are much less harmful or less harmful than cigarettes, but that is not what the consumers around the world believe. And so here are the countries that we've been looking at, and you can see in the blue line the percent of people that think that e-cigarettes are less harmful. And you can see in almost all countries, less than half of the population believe that to be the case. And a good percentage actually think they're more harmful or much more harmful, ranging from small amounts in Japan to 18% in Australia. We've done some repeat surveys in a few countries, and we're not seeing the situation improve in terms of accuracy over time. So this paints a pretty grim picture in terms of where we are currently. What's alarming about this is how do we get out of this mess in some sense? And even in countries, first of all, it was kind of interesting to reflect on Tim's presentation. If you look at the countries where information seems to be somewhat better, the UK, where we have sort of the blue line is much higher than the orange line. And in Sweden, those are countries that were not implementing product bans and had were more sort of generous in the regulation from Tim's thing. Now, economists are very cautious of making causality statements, but it was an intriguing connection with what Tim has described up front. So then we went on we asked another question, and we asked our respondents to estimate the lifespan of people who continue to smoke or continue to vape, and we converted this into their perceived life years lost from being sort of an everyday vapor or everyday smoker or over a good portion of their time. And this is what their responses were. And there's a lot of interesting economic insight in some of this. So again, across all countries, we see the vertical dotted line is what we believe is the consensus of estimates of what the actual life years are lost from vaping, given the risks. And you could see that smoking much higher expected life loss than vaping, because vaping products are less harmful. And you could see a way overestimation on the vaping perceived life years lost from vaping compared to what we believe is the sort of expert consensus of how harmful they are. And so this is again a problem. And we could see that smoking, some countries are pretty accurate in terms of, like in the US and the UK, the perceived life years lost from smoking are about near where the consensus estimates are. But in some countries, actually, we see an underestimate of the perceived life years lost from smoking. So there's a lot to learn from this. But what I take from this as well is how correlated the blue and within each country, how correlated the blue and the orange lines are. And this gets back to some insights that Kip Viscusi had about how, when new products come onto the market, how does one form risk perceptions about them? And it's pretty clear from these sets of graphs that the perceptions of smoking influence perceptions of vaping, and that these are very closely tied. And so what Kip Viscusi talks about is a Bayesian learning model, and you start your perceptions of new products based on something that you sort of know about somewhat. And since smoking and cigarettes and e-cigarettes are related, that it seems that the starting point for vaping perceptions is smoking perceptions. So how, as public policy, do we break these ties? The concerning thing from my perspective is a lot of the regulations, even in countries that allow these products, do not allow them to talk about their harm, the relative harm compared to cigarettes. And if you depend on government solely to make those, send those messages, we could see that's not likely to happen. And so one possible solution to some of this might be to relax some of the advertising restrictions when these products are approved and are regulated, that allow them to make claims about their relative harm, because firms are experts in communicating the attributes of their products to consumers, much more so than any public entity, any government entity. And so that would be where I think future research should look at, is the role that how promotion and firm advertising might help align perceptions with reality.
Thanks, Alan. First, a reminder for the audience, if you'd like to submit a question to the panelists, please feel free to click on the Q&A button again at the bottom of your screen and type your question. We'll see your question and be able to address it anonymously. Just to follow up, Alan, on what you said, maybe I can bring Don in as well, though, Alan, feel free to jump in. Could the regulations themselves that affect access to ends products transmit information to consumers in ways that informs their perception of relative risk as well?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, there's a very direct way that we've actually done some research on that we haven't totally documented at all, but one of the regulations in the US requires a warning label on e-cigarettes that says this product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive chemical. This was adopted as a result of the 2016 deeming regulation, as it's known in the US. And because of the US sort of role in markets and things, you see that label show up on e-cigarettes in a lot of different countries. And what we looked into, is another part of the information story that Alan's slides didn't show, but others, including the Global Action Foundation, have shown, is that sort of a root piece of misinformation is that nicotine is harmful, that nicotine causes cancer and the other major consequences. And, as was said long ago, people smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar. The nicotine safe, the tar is safe but addictive. The tar is what causes the lung cancer and everything else. So what we've found some research findings is that because of that pre-existing misinformation that nicotine is bad, when people who are exposed to that label that the FDA adopted about e-cigarettes are less likely to choose e-cigarettes and are actually more likely to choose cigarettes. And this gets into the sort of a mindset that I like my cigarettes, why should I switch to e-cigarettes? Because it's the nicotine that's going to kill me. And I've heard from experts in the area, including Mitch Zeller, former director of the Center for Tobacco Products at FDA, that's also sort of held back the growth of the nicotine replacement therapy market. That smokers would say, why should I die from a nicotine patch when I'd rather die from smoking my Marlboros? And so I think, that's a very direct way where the regulation, I think, has been potentially, we're finding evidence that it's backfiring a little bit. I mean, more indirectly, there's an idea that's around economics and other areas a lot that I think your question was driving at, that, just by taking action, the government may also sort of send a signal. Why are we regulating this product? Why are we, if it's a problem, why are we taxing this product? And so I think, as Alan was saying, well, it's interesting that the regulation, the countries in which e-cigarettes are less regulated have more, better information about e-cigarettes and the relative risk of e-cigarettes. It's hard to know if that's cause or effect. It might be a well-informed public has helped those countries adopt better policies, or it might be that those policies have helped the consumers become better informed. And likewise, in other countries where they ban things, why are we banning this if it's not bad? Something we saw in some research we did that's coming out in Economic Inquiry that looked into the kind of the natural experiment created by the Valley outbreak, which was not due to nicotine e-cigarettes, but were due to illegal e-cigarettes containing THC. But it made a lot of people think that e-cigarettes were bad, and in particular, a lot of places, some states in the U.S. banned e-cigarettes and/or banned flavors, and all those ideas got sort of tangled up in people's perceptions. And I think we see some evidence that a lot of people think flavored e-cigarettes must be even more harmful than regular e-cigarettes. And sometimes, again, that must be why we're banning them, even though that's more about the trade-off between trying to prevent youth from starting than their safety per se.
I'll just say,
sorry, I was going to add something, Joe, if that's all right. To your point, I mean, my view is maybe even stronger than that. I think that the regulation is having very little impact on whether or not consumers can get products. So let's look at the US. The regulatory situation is actually having zero impact on what consumers are buying or not. It's having a massive impact on the conception that they have about the category. And so I think it's much more important than actually the rules themselves are not being enforced. No one's really managing to manage this sector well, but it's having a massive impact on what consumers think about the category.
Yeah, I was just going to add one other slight addition to what Don was saying was, so during the Valley, what they call the Valley crisis, it was very interesting to compare the UK and the US. So the US sort of put pretty aggressive statements and did not clarify very much the difference between THC products at the beginning of the crisis and nicotine-based vaping products. In the UK, when this Valley crisis was happening, it was happening in the US, but the UK was very aggressive at saying, regardless of what if this Valley thing, do not return to cigarettes if you're smoking, if you're vaping, and was much more aggressive. And in some work where we've showed that the change in perceptions from that differential government approach towards the Valley could have changed perceptions on the margin as well. So again, government statements about these things do seem to penetrate into the public. I agree with Tim that the regulations themselves often signal things to consumers like, well, if they're regulating, it must be pretty bad. So
there is some evidence among youths in the monitoring the future data in a piece Rahi Abuk and his colleagues published in the Journal of Health Economics, suggesting that increases in ends taxes did increase sort of youth's perceptions that e-cigarettes were a dangerous product with high health risks. So yeah, there's some evidence of that. So Giorgi, you've conducted research on effective risk communication for e-cigarettes among public health professionals, trying to see how we might get out of some of the misperception issues. So how might public health agencies account for misinformation about the health consequences or risk potential of e-cigarettes compared to cigarettes, and how might communication strategies be improved?
Thank you, Joe, for the question. Let me briefly share my slides as well. But before we jump to the research results we conducted in Georgia and Ukraine, let me just say that despite substantial scientific evidence, the relative health risks of e-cigarette use compared to conventional smoking are, as we already said, often misunderstood among public, among health authorities, among smokers. And public health messages frequently emphasize the absolute risks of tobacco products, overshadowing the comparative risks between e-cigarettes and combustibles. And at the same time, research indicates that risk perception significantly influences tobacco use patterns. Studies also show that a prevalent reason for e-cigarette use is a belief that they are less harmful than conventional cigarettes, and moreover, certain groups' perception of e-cigarettes as less dangerous is linked in several studies to a higher likelihood of their future use. Research also shows that comparative health warnings, such as use of this product is much less harmful than smoking, are more effective in reducing harm perception and encouraging smokers to switch to e-cigarettes than absolute health warning about the nicotine addiction. I mean, the same warning as Professor Donald already mentioned, that this product contains nicotine, which is highly addictive. And at the same time, comparative messages do not increase use intention among non-smokers. So this suggests that they can act as an effective harm reduction tools without increasing e-cigarette uptake among non-smokers, or which is commonly stated in some literature among youth. So in 2022, our think tank Health Initiatives conducted nationally representative surveys in Ukraine and Georgia to assess the perceived relative harm of e-cigarettes. We asked if respondents agreed that using e-cigarettes is more harmful than smoking conventional cigarettes. And results showed much higher extent of misinformation than presented earlier by Professor Ellen Mathios in their study among 8 or 9 countries. I don't remember the exact number, but in Ukraine and Georgia, 38 and 32% of adults mistakenly believed that e-cigarettes were more harmful than cigarettes. Among non-smokers and non-users of any nicotine product, this misconception was slightly lower at 30 and 20%, at 25% respectively. However, this belief was the highest among smokers, with every second smoker were misinformed during the study. Interestingly, only a small percentage of vapers and HTP users in Ukraine perceived e-cigarettes as more harmful than conventional cigarettes, while in Georgia, vapers and HTP users, so users of heated tobacco, had similar perceptions to smokers. This suggests that in Ukraine, relative risk perception might be a significant determinant of vaping, whereas in Georgia, vapers choose e-cigarette despite their beliefs about relative health risks. This is quite surprising and contradicts the literature. However, this results in case of Georgia might be driven by the small number of vapers and insufficient number of vapor respondents in our survey. However, these findings still once more highlights the urgent need for clear comparative health messages to correct misconceptions and better inform public perceptions, which will ultimately support harm reduction strategies. Let me stop share here.
Great. Do you have thoughts on how sort of public health officials could better kind of communicate?
Regulation, I think, is one thing, because in our part of the world, as already mentioned by other panelists, the stricter the regulation, the stricter are absolute health warnings towards both heated tobacco products and ends. In case of heated tobacco products, the situation is much worse because, as we know, heated tobacco are produced by tobacco manufacturers, and the opposition towards them is quite stricter compared to electronic cigarettes. But even compared to the electronic cigarettes, in Georgia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and I know several other countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, public health officials, they push for absolute health warning, and sometimes misinformation. They spread the misinformation that, for example, electronic cigarettes does not increase and does not help smokers to cease smoking, quit smoking, and switch to the safer alternatives. So in case of communication from health authorities, I think putting the comparative health messages first based on the evidence and science is a key.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Giorgi. So clearly, different consumers are using ends for different reasons. Some may use ends as a tool for smoking cessation, others for a less harmful short-term nicotine fix, and others that maybe we worry about. Youths may try e-cigarettes kind of on a path to more harmful addiction. Maybe it's kind of a gateway to combustibles or riskier behaviors. So James, if we can bring you in, how might we think about optimal regulatory action in the context of these different motives for consumer use?
Well, thanks for the question, Joe. I think the key here for good regulation is really that we want to do is discourage use by youths, young people that don't already smoke, while at the same time cutting the path between Scylla and Charybdis, not discouraging smokers to substitute to e-cigarettes. We've already mentioned a little bit about the health impacts of ENDS. I won't say more about that here. I'll just note that my comments are predicated on the fact that it's highly likely that ENDS are much less risky to use than smoking cigarettes. I think there's really two sets of policy elements to get at the goal here. And I'll just mention very briefly, I have a book coming out in a few days, actually, with Sam Hampshire and Sud Parwadon called Clearing the Air on E-Cigarettes, where we go over what I'm about to talk about briefly in detail. The first set of policies, I think what you want to do is to regulate e-cigarettes less stringently than e-cigarettes, and perhaps much less stringently. This notion of differential taxation was already raised by Don and others. I think where you start is with differential taxation. Regardless of your motive for taxing, whether it's to protect people from themselves or to protect people from externalities, the differential health risk would lead you to tax ENDS less and probably much less than cigarettes. You can have differential place-based use restrictions, right? To encourage substitution, you might consider allowing use of e-cigarettes indoors in some places, at least, where you would not allow smoking. Differential health warnings. Packs of cigarettes say that smoking kills, and that's a good warning. There is already in the US and in several places a different health warning for e-cigarettes. I would probably also get rid of the scare word chemical in the US warning. Differential minimum age restrictions. For example, you could set something like 19 years old for using ENDS, and that would allow you to raise the smoking age to 21 in many places around the world where it's still at 18. And that would communicate a difference in relative risk. You could have differential flavor restrictions, or I think we'll be talking about flavors later. But for example, you could consider not banning flavors for ENDS the way that we do for cigarettes, or differential ad restrictions. One innovative policy proposal is when manufacturers of cigarettes also manufacture reduced harm products, let them allow advertise those on the cigarette packs themselves. And that's not something that anyone does, but something we could think about. And then just briefly, to think about regulating ENDS to reduce youth by kids. The obvious one is age restrictions, which I've already mentioned. Restrictions on public use could be stricter in places where the eyes of young people are. So for example, locations frequented by youth, schools would be an obvious one. You might want to ban ENDS there as well as cigarettes. And finally, you could also target the sorts of advertising that you allow and ban could be targeted towards youth concerns as well. Now, in brief progressive order from most acceptable to hardest to do in countries with strong corporate freedom of speech laws, you could ban underage or young-looking models in advertising. You could ban use of cartoons and comic characters, Joe Camel style advertising. You could more controversially ban indirect or lifestyle appeals, wealth, coolness, prestige, sex. These are not necessarily informative advertising. That has to do with persuasive advertising. What you probably do not want to do is to ban all advertising of e-cigarettes, though, because again, you want smokers to switch.
No, that's super interesting, and we do know that at least some policy interventions that are designed to to curb youth access to ends have induced some substitution toward combustibles, things like ends taxes, even some evidence on flavor restrictions doing something similar, and potentially causing sort of net tobacco related kind of public health harm, sort of for youths. I guess it gets down to what the counterfactual is, especially for somebody who's sort of using ends. If it's abstinence from all tobacco products, then maybe restricting access to ends is a good idea from the perspective of public health. But if the counterfactual is a more harmful product, then maybe it's not clear that sort of restricting access is a good idea. What do we learn from, right? There's Alan, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Cliff alluded to the fact that thinking about harm reduction is not, unique to this relatively new product on the market. We've been thinking about it when, advising for, contraceptive-based sex education programs in schools, or thinking about seatbelts and clean needle programs. I mean, how can our past experiences with thinking about people substituting toward safer behaviors kind of inform our current thinking about optimal ends regulation?
Yeah, it's very challenging. Part of this also comes from the historical who provides e-cigarettes and the sort of the reputation of tobacco companies as they now are also getting into e-cigarette production. It's very hard to overcome that reputation loss they had from all the actions they took for years and years. And so in many ways, it would be easier for firms not associated with tobacco companies potentially to make these gains, but our regulatory structures make it so that it's very challenging for small startup firms and small manufacturers to deal with the regulatory structures that they're in. So in some sense, the whole system is designed, at least in the US, to have only sort of the firms that were in this related business to sort of be maybe the players in the future. So this is a challenge. I don't quite have a great answer as to how to overcome it, but it might be why it's somewhat different than other harm reduction products, because there's not sort of the culture of the evil tobacco companies that pervade the providers of the reduced harm products. That's just one. I don't know how relevant it is, but I'll just put it out there.
I was just going to jump in. I think maybe one of the part of the answer is that there's such a wide variety of risk continuums and harm reduction, whatever we want to call it, and that maybe maybe it's hard to learn lessons from other, because what Alan was talking about, might say, okay, well, proponents of airbags and seat belts to reduce car safety didn't have a whole lot of pushback from distrust of the automobile industry, though actually that's how Ralph Nader got a start. But mainly I think that was the industry wasn't seen as bad guys. But on the other hand, other harm reduction that's well known in public health about giving methadone to heroin users, it's not like we think, well, I'm not sure sometimes. I don't think we think that the tobacco industry is a more immoral group than heroin pushers. So that, in that case, both have supply sides that we might be very concerned about. But somehow the methadone, I guess maybe Alan's point still holds that methadone, the people making money off of methadone are not the same people making money off of heroin. While there is this concern that maybe the people making money off of e-cigarettes, because of all the barriers to entry that have pushed out the little manufacturers in the US now, the people that are making money off the e-cigarettes are some of the major tobacco companies. So maybe your analogy, maybe it works to some extent, but I guess I just would like to say that, trying to learn from the past is always a great idea, but sometimes things are just too different.
That's super helpful. I want to take a minute to talk about methodology and the particular contributions that economists can bring to this conversation about information, optimal regulation. So what kinds of methodological approaches do economists have kind of a comparative advantage in bringing to the literature to evaluate the impacts of regulations, assess preferences of consumers, and ultimately, right, to inform cost-benefit analysis? What are we economists kind of adding to this conversation methodologically? So James, Don, if you guys want to chime in. I know you've both thought about this.
Sure. I can kick this one off. I'll definitely leave opening for others to add. I would say not only do we have a comparative advantage, but we have an absolute advantage as econometricians in this area, because econometrics, the reason why we don't just use the word statistics, the reason why we have our own term is that from the very beginning of our field, we've had to deal with working with non-experimental data and finding ways to find causal relationships when you haven't run a randomized controlled trial. So this is really this is what we do. This is what we do well. For impact of regulations, I think our economists' favorite econometric toolbox here is the set of quasi-experimental methods. And there are many types, differences in differences estimation, synthetic control, et cetera. But in all of those, there's an attempt to create valid treatment and control groups so that the treatment effect of the regulation of interest can be measured. And just mention some of the results that have come out from those sorts of studies in recent years, some of which have already been mentioned, that higher taxes on e-cigarettes drive youth, pregnant women, and adults in general to smoke more. Adding e-cigarettes to public smoking bans in the US reduced the effect of those bans on reducing smoking. That's done with some work by Abby Friedman and others. Restricting access to by minors to e-cigarettes is causally associated with increasing smoking among youth, right? So this is what economists do well, not only the methodology, but also the expectation that we should look for unintended consequences of regulation. Let me briefly talk a little bit about assessing preferences. So typically, those are either assessed through demand estimation using market data, or alternatively through stated preference studies. I think Don will probably have more to say about the latter. Let me just briefly mention the advantage of market-based studies is that you have consumers putting their money where their mouths are here. They're actually revealing their preferences through their actions. We know that talk is cheap, so we always have a little bit of hesitation working with just stated preference studies. The difficulty, of course, working with actual market data is that things like prices, for example, and the set of products are not set by the experimenter. And so, again, you have to use some more advanced econometric techniques like instrumental variables regression, for example, to deal with those. And then, of course, the results from all of these sorts of things can feed into cost-benefit analysis, again, a specialty of Don's.
I guess that sets me up to jump in on a couple of points. I mean, first of all, I agree entirely with Jim's big points about, our econometrics is a field because is a word and a term and an area because it builds on how economists analyze data. And I would just also emphasize that, especially when we look at the market data, it's not just a set of tools like difference in difference or synthetic controls. Those tools are becoming increasingly adopted by other fields. But it's also because we have the social science models of economics to guide us on how to use those tools and how to find what's sort of a useful quasi-experiment. And as James was pointing out, lots of self-selection into things, for example, that's economic optimizing. And that is something that, again, is part of the economist comparative and absolute advantage and understanding. But I do want to make as James pointed out, we've been using a lot of stated preference methods, and I do want to sort of, really not just argue, but kind of, propose that this should be that they are an important part of the toolbox, especially in the context of looking at perspective analysis of policies in general, tobacco regulatory policies in particular. Prospective policy analysis, prospective cost-benefit analysis, which is something the federal agencies in the US and everywhere else are doing all the time. They've got a regulation and they don't know what's happened. And that's, they don't know what would happen if you do that regulation. And that's kind of the difference. It's a challenge then for the other set of tools in the economist toolkit that can look at, here's what happened when they taxed e-cigarettes or when they did X, Y, or Z regulation. But what if we're thinking about a regulation that's never really been adopted before? And that's where these stated preference methods, including discrete choice experiments, I think are really valuable. Now, in economics, stated preference methods are also used by like environmental economists precisely because a market doesn't exist at all. So they want to find out, they're very famous discussions of use of stated preference methods to evaluate what happened when the Exxon Valdez spilled oil up in Alaska and ruined a beautiful Alaska scenery and killed off lots of birds and seals and things. And that's one set of challenges. But another area that's actually more like, I think, the way economists are using stated preference methods about tobacco regulatory policy is that discrete choice experiments and the associated methods are really widely used in marketing, including marketing for pharmaceutical products, but marketing for any products. And this is because marketers are trying to figure out, what will happen if we release this product with these attributes and these prices. So they're trying to get evidence on how will consumers behave when they see a market that has not existed before. And that's the kind of situation that we're in when we're doing prospective regulatory analysis and cost-benefit analysis. How will consumers behave if we ban menthol entirely across the US? We haven't seen that, but we can go out and run a discrete choice experiment. And, this adds, there are two parts, obviously, important questions about research strength. And one is the internal consistency. Internal validity, does the estimate, are we identifying a causal effect? And like any other experiment, discrete choice experiments have a real strength in internal validity because they experimentally randomly vary the prices and the other attributes. So we know that, with a lot of confidence that the changes in stated preferences due to experimental variation in these attributes is causally related to the experiment. It's not a self-selection issue or anything, because it's not a market endogeneity issue. Now, the other part of the research validity is the external validity. And I think here it's important to realize, go back to that distinction I was making between the use of stated preference methods in environmental economics versus in marketing. In environmental economics, in some types of environmental economics, we have no idea how people really value a pristine Alaska wilderness. There's no other way we can get at that. So we can't really check the external validity very well. And there's a lot of research that suggests that in general, when you're dealing with these environmental goods that people don't have much experience with, stated preferences may not have a lot of or have questionable external validity. But in tobacco regulatory choices, we're asking people in our discrete choice experiments about products that they're extremely familiar with. We're looking at surveys of smokers about cigarettes, which these are things that they're buying, on a weekly or more often basis. And we're asking them about e-cigarettes, which if they haven't already used, their friends have used, or they're up there on the shelves. There's just a lot of familiarity, and all the research, a lot of research and external validity of stated preference methods say, that's a really good setting to expect you'll have externally valid answers from your stated preference methods, where your stated preference is going to be a good indicator of what your revealed preference actually will happen in markets. Now, that question about external validity is something that, economists using discrete choice experiments should never, assume has been answered. We always need to go back and look at the data. It'll be very interesting to try to compare when you can. What did an experimental thing say about, what did a discrete choice experiment say might happen versus what actually did happen when a policy was enacted. And we're starting to see some opportunities for that. For example, Australia is tightening up its regulatory policies and might have another big change and really take a lot more e-cigarettes off the market. And we have a discrete choice experiment that predicts what will happen if that happens, but we'll be interested to see how it works out. I think a lot of the, I should just say one other contribution I should say about the stated preference methods is that they allow economists to research into illegal markets. And that's not just illegal markets that didn't exist before, but even currently existing illegal markets are real hard to study with other methods. We don't have great ways to measure illegal behavior. We don't have things like, tax reported sales precisely because it's an underground, illicit, illegal market, whatever you want to call it. And so I think that's another really important part, because as Tim was pointing out, a lot of the regulations haven't actually wiped out the markets at all. In Australia and the US, where they really have tight regulations on certain types of products, those products are flourishing in markets that are illegal, at least, statutorily illegal, even though it's sort of hard to call a product that's providing almost the entire market illegal. I mean, a lot of people, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't think a lot of consumers realize they're buying illegal products when they're buying these things, but they are illegal. So I'll stop there with my soapbox, I guess, about that discrete choice experiments belong in the toolkit of economists, as well as the quasi-experimental methods that James mentioned.
I'll just add one thing to what Dom was saying. So in a good example of the value of them, even on this illegal market stuff. So we have work, it's NBR working paper, but we have it submitted to a journal. But on looking at, would consumers who smoke menthol cigarettes, how will they react to the proposed ban on menthol cigarettes? And whatever the results we find, it's very important for the regulators to note that what we find is at least a stated willingness to purchase menthol cigarettes in illicit markets. And we were quite surprised by the level at which people seem to be willing to do that. So if this ends up being passed, it's currently sort of been postponed. At the Biden administration sort of putting it off till probably after the election. It's very useful to know that there's going to be very likely there's going to be a big demand for illegal markets here. And so how the government then enforces those markets, it's a resource allocation issue that's raised. The way the FDA went in its proposal, the best data they could get was basically they decided to do what's called expert elicitation on how big this market might be. And they had experts talk about it and come up with some view of it, very much not data driven, but again, sort of a sense of experts. So we're adding data to that argument. And again, whatever happens, we think it's very useful to understand what the demand side might be as this regulation proceeds through, if it does.
So I want to get to sort of a few questions that audience members were asking. One theme of at least a few questions involved, there have been a lot of regulations of access to ends products on the demand side. The questions related to sort of the supply side, particularly when we're thinking about minimum age restrictions and enforcement. What do we know about, policies that are imposing sort of stricter penalties on retailers who are selling products to consumers that they shouldn't be selling to. Is that a policy lever that's underutilized? Could it help things like licensure laws or bigger fines for selling to underage consumers? Anybody like to field that?
Well, now there has been some work, I guess a little bit mixed earlier on, about the retailer compliance checks that the FDA does in the US. I think different studies found somewhat different things. I mean, it would seem, you know, that is one certain policy, certainly a policy tool, and technology keeps on improving in terms of, you know, improving that. Well, I guess I think one of the more interesting policies in that is actually sort of a connection with the retailer and the product, and that are these age-gated e-cigarettes devices that people have been developing, where when the product is sold, it will be only usable by the person who purchases, and that's where you do the first age verification, and then that product is now, you know, can't wander off from the legal market, you know, from a legal purchaser into the underage purchasing. Because I think my guess is that, and it's not a guess. I mean, the research on where underage people are getting e-cigarettes, a lot of it is from friends and social sources, not from the retailer. So trying to hit the retailers itself, or hit the retailers harder, might not be that effective. But
Yeah, that's a theme of some work in an NBER paper that my colleagues and I put out a couple of weeks ago on retail licensure laws, was sort of a reason why they didn't seem to be very effective for most teenagers in keeping e-cigarettes out of their hands. In fact, you know, nearly 80% of teenage ENDS users are not buying their e-cigarettes directly from a retailer. They're getting it from some, as you said, you know, informal social source, borrowing, bumming, you know.
And this is where, you know, we could talk about, you know, prior prohibition, so to speak. I mean, you know, kids have had access to alcohol, underage drinkers, you know, in the US, you know, for decades, and it doesn't really seem to have changed very much. And I'm not sure that more enforcement against, again, the retailers is going to work. I mean, the other thing I just would point out is that, you know, it's hard to disentangle T21 that increased the purchase age to 21 for all tobacco products, including e-cigarettes, to 21, from, and that happened in late 2019, from the impact of the COVID epidemic, which I think might have disrupted these social sources. But, you know, e-cigarette use among teens has dropped from a lot in the US, and cigarette use is continued its trend down in the US. And so the whole arguments about you know, the focus on youth and trying to further tamp that down is maybe not the highest research, or well, research, but also really policy emphasis.
Sure. Anybody else want to add any comments on that?
Yeah, I was just going to add something from a non-economist perspective. I suppose from a sort of a policy and legal perspective, I think the thing to bear in mind, I mean, there's been lots of really good suggestions in this discussion around how legislation could be changed to, I guess, basically prioritize low risk products over the ones that we know are really dangerous. I think there's a real balance to be made. I think, you know, we can have these theoretical discussions, but actually when you hit reality, of course, it's all about politics, and particularly in this sector, it's all about politics. It's highly controversial. And again, I think that, you know, laws and regulations are being put in place, which have really no hope of being implemented in light of the consumer demand. So it's always going to be a balance. You need to get regulations that broadly bring the kinds of manufacturers and brands into the sector that, you know, play by the rules, and keep the ones that don't out. And it's going to be very difficult to take an absolutist view, which, you know, we're seeing in the US and many other countries that have banned products. It's just not going to work, and people are going to get hold of these products anyway. And then you've really lost control of the of the argument anyway. You can talk about the theory behind it, but in fact, the reality on the ground is people are buying products and you don't have any control over them. Yeah, so there's a sort of policy thinking around this topic, I think.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, everyone. We're about out of time for the webinar. I want to thank Alan Mathios, Don Kenkel, James Prieger, Tim Phillips, Giorgi Mzhavanadze, and Cliff Douglas for participating in what I think has been a great event. And thanks to Ida for all her work in helping organizing this. So we bring this first public webinar of Global Action to End Smoking to a close with thanks to everyone who participated.